This is Dave Monk, your Prarie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And today we have Don Davis as guest. He's just been to New Zealand with his wife. And we'll have him to
tell you a little bit about New Zealand and some of the things I did. It's a travel log today.
Interestingly, he is at the moment engineering the board at the same time as being guest, because he's a WEFT board member and
an air shifter.
And he's known as Zoot.
Can I plug my own show?
Yes.
Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, jazz.
Yes.
Okay, but today is something different.
So, first I want to say something about salvage. The local dumpsters, I work with a couple of local dumpsters and a toter to try and reduce the amount of garbage that goes out that's recyclable. So sometimes it amazes me how much recyclable material ends up in the dumpster over a 2-day period. This is what we got the last 2 days. A large microwave, a television set, a monitor, a director's aluminum chair, and the only thing wrong with it was a canvas connection that needs repair. 2 office chairs, and all these items take up a huge amount of space. So if you put one office chair in the middle of a small dumpster, you don't have any room for anyone else. So 50 pounds of A-grade paper and magazines, 2 bags of shredded A-grade paper. We have a cardboard dumpster that takes A-grade paper next door. You only have to throw it in that direction. 30 or so aluminum cans. 30 cans is about a pound of aluminum. A toter full of plastic milk jugs, and sometimes the containers even include water. So we pay for water to take a trip to Clinton, 35 mile away, and be emptied there. It would seem that it could be emptied out before it's put into the garbage. Bottles don't bring you very much. They do involve quite a lot of electricity, because it comes basically from silica sand, and you can buy sand fairly cheaply, but there's still a lot of electricity used to make those bottles, and you can hopefully store glass so that in years ahead, when we might not have as much electricity, we could go to that source and reuse the bottles. Steel cans, metal, there's various types of metal ranging up to stainless steel. And then, of course, there's the remaining garbage, which is mostly food scraps that could be composted. Computer equipment we didn't have this week, but we often do have computer equipment and hazardous waste materials into the bin, styrofoam, and some of this is material that you get paid for, and so cans that get paid for. Styrofoam you can't work with, despite the fact that it has a nice little sign that says can be recycled. It's only recyclable where there's a unit in Indianapolis or Chicago that can boil down very lightweight material. But most of the doggy bags that come out of restaurants are styrofoam, and they occupy a large part of the waste stream. If not in the bin, they're floating around in the street. So that's enough to say something about the materials that were wasted this week. I have some evil intent because Don is a finance teacher, and
we do talk about it, that there is a cost. And one of the things that finance has ignored is, the costs that are not borne by the user.
Yes.
So if I throw stuff in the landfill, I don't ever see that cost, right? Well, yeah, we do. And it's more than just the money that has to go into taxes to buy the land, to manage the landfill, everything else. So the more you can keep out of it, the better. The more you can put back into the stream, the better. And I think business is just now starting to figure that out.
I figure that I'm opposite Radio Maria restaurant, and people watch what I'm doing. They have to wonder what I'm doing. It costs.
Way better. Sorry.
You got to come. It costs. I figure it costs me $10 an hour, which is low pay for someone who has 2 degrees and a diploma. It costs me about $3,000 a year to remove the recyclables from 2 dumpsters and a toter.
Well, and I will say this at the source, my house, it's so much easier to deal with at that point rather than getting it. My wife and I, we don't produce more than a small bag of landfill waste every couple of weeks.
Yes.
But we produce a lot of paper and some other stuff. So anyhow.
So that is my small rant for today. There are a few other things that I had in mind. Copier use I am worried about because copiers come with toner, and if you don't use the toner every week, then the nipples freeze up, and this seems to me to be an industrial situation that could be researched and improved, because the toner, you can buy the machine for $100, and the toner will cost you $90 for black and 3 colors. The architecture students have an exercise on taking the Pocket Prairie across the way into a bookstore. So they have to figure out how to do it. So I'm meeting up on Monday with a woman who wants to include the prairie in the bookstore situation. And there is information in the newspaper that politicians are suggesting that a rail go through from Galesburg to Indianapolis, and that is the sort of thing that frightens the bejesus out of trail people who are not always aware that a lot of the money that they get for an interim trail is coming from a Rail Banking Act, which is designed to preserve railroads. And so that's what the politicians are talking about. So that's enough. Let's talk to Don and tell us a little bit about New Zealand. It's sort of a spin-off from the Gondwana land. It's 2,000 miles from Australia, but it's...
And I will say this about New Zealand. It is in the middle of nowhere. It is far from anywhere. And that's good and bad. It takes a long time to get to the United States. And even, we tend to think of Australia and New Zealand as one area.
Yes, part of that is due to the Anzac troops that went together in World War I and World War II.
And there are a lot of things that New Zealand and Australia have done together historically over time. They were natural trade partners as well. But, it takes as long to get from New Zealand to even Sydney, which is the closest point in Australia. It still takes as far as it does to go from Chicago to L.A. I mean, it's a long way. And it is a different culture, too.
From a plate tectonics point of view, New Zealand is on the Pacific Rim, and that's a different cat than the Gondwana land, which is Australia. So you have volcanism, and you have Christchurch, and you explained to me that you had an earthquake just after you left.
Yeah, just after we left, not while we were there. But they had a huge earthquake just several years ago, 3 years ago now, and still not recovered from it. A lot of that is because the entire population of New Zealand is about the size of Chicago. It's about 12 million people, a little bit more. Over 100 million sheep is the joke. But they don't have a lot of labor. They don't have a lot of people that can do that sort of stuff. I say when San Francisco has an earthquake, tens of thousands of people are in their truck going out there because they know there'll be work, but there just is not the labor pool of the population in New Zealand. So it takes a long time to get things done. And they'll let you work there for a year. You can get a work visa fairly easily if you're young and willing to work. So
it's fairly isolated if you want to go to a meeting in Chicago. It's a long way away.
As a matter of fact, to Dallas, it's 14 and a half hours. So, yeah, it's a long
It used
way.
to be 18 hours.
Yeah.
You used to have to stop in Fiji and Hawaii.
And, well, now that they have the huge Airbus. Listen, I used up my carbon footprint for several years on this particular trip because it is so far away. It's as far as I've ever gone. And, the big Airbus that holds 300 people, I guess per person it's less, but, it's...
So did you look out the window down at Easter Island and those places?
As much as possible, you're over ocean and it's dark most of the time on the way back. But, if it wasn't so far away, I would go to New Zealand in a heartbeat. It is a wonderful place to visit. I can see where I'd love to live there for a while, but, there'd be some problems. It is so far away. Gas is over $8 a gallon. Still, and they were talking about how cheap it is now, and I cringe.
They are a part of the world. They're anti-nuke.
Oh yes,
and they're Greenpeace people.
I will say this: that what my wife and I did is we started up in the very northern island in Auckland
with hot pools,
hot pools, Rotorua, and all that sort of thing. And we took the ferry across to the South Island, and drove down to Queenstown. So we drove pretty much the whole country over a 3-week period of time.
You almost drove to glaciers.
We drove past several glaciers. We went to those glaciers, Franz Josef and Fox.
So the fjords are on the west side.
Yeah, Milford Sound and all the fjords. It's what my wife and I notice is that New Zealand is really no more beautiful than the United States. I mean, the U.S. is an incredible country. We have incredible stuff here. The difference is, in a given day, I might drive through land that looks like it's the Napa Valley wine country, and then a few hours later, I'm into the southern Appalachians, and then driving through the Peak District. I mean, it's incredibly diverse very quickly because it's such a small country.
Yes.
And it is an island country. It was volcanically formed, so it's high in the middle, goes up to a few thousand meters, 9,000 feet, I guess, is Mount Cook, the tallest point. And... but it very quickly drops off to the ocean. So, and it is summer there right now. So it was up in the 70s and 80s every day.
90s sometimes.
Not till we got to Australia. There it got real hot. But, I will say for me it's the perfect summertime atmosphere because it doesn't get real hot, but in the evening it cools down because you are a huge island.
It was settled probably in the Australia got settled by convicts that couldn't come to America any longer.
Well, you know that New Zealand was settled thousands of years ago.
Yes. Well, so was the U.S.
Yeah.
And so was Australia.
And that is a part of their culture. The Maoris were the original tribes of New Zealand, the Aboriginals, the First Peoples, whatever you want to call them.
Yes, they're oceanic. They're not Australian. They're not on the Gondwana land.
Right.
That was the big block of plate tectonics that came down from India. Yeah. And then was isolated.
And brought people with it.
Yes.
The Aboriginals of Australia, didn't travel there, but it took boats to get people to New Zealand.
Yes, and they were advanced beyond the Stone Age. Aboriginal in Australia. They were selling or exchanging potatoes and things like that to other islands, so they knew how to navigate long before there were Englishmen there.
I had not realized the amount of seaworthiness that these people had because the whole southern Pacific was their playground where they did trade with. And
they had outriggers that kept...
and they could go across the ocean in something that that we would just cringe at.
And I think they knew stars and how to manage them.
Yeah, and knew what animals were good to eat and what weren't, and most of what survives of the Maori culture is the seafaring part, the fishing part. But they were a lot of different tribes all over these islands, and even on the island of New Zealand, you had a number of different tribes, and they would war with each other. So a lot of their weaponry is also still around.
Yes, there were still some headhunters early in the Pacific, and this is the Pacific Rim, so the oceanic people relate to other oceanic groups.
The way they can tell where the groups come from and how they got there is linguistically. There's a number of different languages, and I wish I knew what the language base was or the root was, but the Dutch first came there, named the place, then the English came and decided it was theirs, and the tribal warfare and the warfare between the English colonists and the native Maoris is part of their history, part of their culture now.
You mentioned the language, but some of the interesting things that have been done with language with the Maoris is that children learn by statements. So long statements, do, and they remember that. And so there has been some theory about doing that with children here, to learn not just by one word at a time, but by.
Would you like me to repeat the Gettysburg Address or the the prologue to I used to have to do that as a child, and no one does that anymore. I wish. And there is something to be said for those memorization techniques. And yes, in non-written languages, that's the only way you could pass your culture down, was to make sure people remembered those sorts of things.
So were you asked to dance with the Maoris?
I am not asked to dance with anybody, much less the Maoris.
They are dancers and singers. They have loud voices.
Yeah,
They play football very well. I can remember the day when...
I did go to watch them dance in a particular... it was a performance that they did. And they do performances, and there are Maori little theaters and things of this sort. The language has become a part of the culture by edict, by law. About 20 years ago, the Maoris were integrated, so to speak. They were given Commonwealth status by the Queen and all sorts of things of this sort.
For a long time, they didn't have status, and I still think they don't have all that status. They're good. They're a tourist attraction, but...
I say, at this point, it's by edict. So almost all governmental law signs come in two languages, and very much like in Quebec, where you see that. Only this language was not French. It would take me forever to learn how to read. As a matter of fact, getting on the last plane out of the country, I was sitting talking with a doctor who went over there to work with the native populations, and she said she'd been there for 15 years and still could just read the smallest amount of Maori. So
yes, there are some popular songs that have become multinational, and I brought one and put it on the thumb, but we have problems with putting thumbs up because the language on the thumb is not compatible. But there's a thing called the Maori Farewell, which is basically a Swiss cradle song that was adapted. There was a visit by the Duke of Wales or one of the English dukes and his entourage, and they visited the Maoris, and the daughter of one Maori citizen who was part European aristocracy and part leader Maori, and she was very good at writing poetry and things like that. So the Maori Farewell is a story that the daughter fell in love with someone from the Duke's entourage, but then he had to leave with it, and so the mother wrote a poem, which was Now is the hour when we must say goodbye. Soon you'll be sailing far across the sea. While you're away, oh, please remember me. When you return, I will be waiting there. And that song is part of the Australian language. The moment you leave Australia at the airport and things like that, that song is sung. And it's a tearjerker because it has a sort of rhythm to it. The Maori language fits in. I worked with a Maori person who was a car mechanic and also a footballer. And when the Maoris came to Australia to go to South Africa, they had to stop because the Maoris on the team were not going to be acceptable in apartheid situation. So the team, I don't think that team went to South Africa, but there's a little bit of relationship there.
Oh yeah.
Some of the universities are small, and so they spill over. So veterinarians were often at the University of Sydney.
And I say it is about a 3-hour flight, so it is the closest place in the world to New Zealand. So there's but it was sort of funny. I saw several people getting on a plane with ski boots, and they were all going off to Japan to go skiing. So, so yeah.
The Australians normally didn't get to move very much because they had to go out by a boat. And it took you 6 weeks to get to England, the mother country.
But again, it's a fun country to visit. As I was telling you earlier, it may be a little difficult as a place to live because there's just not as many workers. There's not as many stores, things of that sort. I have a watch that I travel with that takes a special type of battery. Well, no one in New Zealand could change the battery in my watch. And I thought if I lived here, I'd have to mail this watch back to the United States just to change a battery. That's kind of silly. And once I got to Sydney, I had it done in an hour because there was someone there. It's a large enough population center, large enough city. So yeah, there were little things like there's only 2-lane roads in the whole country. There's not a 4-lane road in the whole country. So transportation is a little more difficult.
You use a small car.
Oh yeah, but they still have to transport trucks and material. A lot of stuff. Yeah, they're smaller trucks, but they're still trucks. And because of the topography of New Zealand, yeah, you're going to have to go up and down hills. So now I will say this. Everybody warned me about the driving in New Zealand, and yeah, it can be. There are a lot of 1-lane bridges. They don't believe in building 2-lane bridges. They're all 2-lane roads, so there's not that room for error. Oh, not to mention the fact you're sitting on the right side of the car and driving on the left side of the road, which makes you think a little bit differently, or it makes you think a little harder. You don't want to get drunk
when you're doing that.
You just have to pay attention constantly. Driving down the road is not so much a problem. It's parking lots and things like that that'll throw you because they are completely backwards. Anyhow, everybody in the country drives the speed limit. No one goes over 100 kilometers per hour. And if you do come up on a truck, they pull off the side of the road and let you around. They're very polite. So, but there were stories while we were there in the paper of just awful accidents. There was one on New Year's or Christmas Eve that killed a family. So, things like that.
Yes.
And the other problem driving there is when you rent a car, if you have an accident, you're out $3,500. That's the deductible. Anyhow, I thought about that the whole time and was
so
really,
when you drove
really carefully.
down to the south, did you go past the hills that were very near the ocean?
Oh yeah, went through. The way we started is we started up at the very north end of the island, and the first place that we went that's rather famous is Rotorua. It's got all the sulfur springs, and it ruined my nose for a couple of days. The people who live there say they can't smell it, but I don't believe it. Then you take a ferry from the North Island to the South Island.
Wellington.
At Wellington. Wellington is a nice city. I would highly recommend it. As a matter of fact, we went into Peter Jackson's studios, Weta Works, and saw the little toys and things that they make for movies now. And they have a wonderful museum of natural history and natural resources there.
And there are birds and creatures that you don't see elsewhere.
Yeah. And I love the birds of that part of the world because they're different than here, but they kind of behave the same, but they're noisier. and they're more bright. We saw trees full of cockatoos, sulfur-crested cockatoos. Well, in the United States, you only see them in cages in people's houses. Out there, we saw a whole flock of them.
And yes, they are noisy. You can't speak when they're screeching.
Yeah, they just when they want to talk, they kind of rule the trees that they're in. And we saw lorikeets, really beautiful birds. There are huge birds. In New Zealand, most of them walk rather than fly.
Yes,
because they didn't have any natural predator for a long time.
Yes.
So they still, even the ones that fly are really bad at it. Yeah, and I say that was probably the most outstanding animal were the birds. Other than that, pretty lot of sheep,
a lot of sheep. Let me say something about the sheep. When you have volcanic activity, you often have fault lines. Mm-hmm. So some of those hills are lined up with several faults, and they have a stream going down, but every so often there's a tarn, and a tarn is where there's been a cross faulting, and so you have these sort of little lakes. Mm-hmm. Some of them are bigger, and those hills are of a volcanic material, I think. I'm pretty sure it's not sedimentary.
No.
So it erodes fairly easily. So the early settlers, and this is when the government was handing out land, you had to buy your land, probably 1868, that sort of thing. Then your first reaction was to take the basin that is around the river and put sheep on it.
Oh, yeah. And
sheep are different than cattle. They're both ruminants, and they can put their tongue around
just rip.
And rip. Well, sheep do it closer than cattle, and so a lot of overstocking. And so some of the big ranches there are between the hills, and it's a matter of if you take the vegetation off, sometimes the frost layer comes down and you can't reinstate that. So they import trees, even the ponderosa pine is there.
Oh, they have a real problem with lots of invasive species. I mean, a sheep is an invasive species.
Oh, yes.
They were brought in, the first Hampshire sheep, they know when it actually came, and the first 50 of them died. And then they had to bring other breeds. They finally figured out the Lancashire or something works well.
Merinos for wool.
Yeah. And they have hundreds of varieties now. As a matter of fact, the first movie that Peter Jackson did was called Black Sheep, and it was about vampire sheep, which we joked must be a New Zealander's worst nightmare.
Kemp hares. Kemp hares are hares that are not the wool. There are hair. And so if you're working as a weaver, you take those wools and you make interesting things out of them.
And the wool is still valuable there.
Yes.
I was talking with some people who shear sheep and do things of that sort. Because when I was in England about 5 or 6 years ago, the wool was so useless that they would shear the sheep and just leave the wool in bales out by the side of the road, and if you wanted to take them, take them. They were so...
wool is subject to insect damage and a whole bunch of other things. That has a lanolin in it, which is helpful in some cases, but not so helpful in others. And plastic is more flexible.
Mm-hmm.
So Australia and New Zealand both were running on the sheep's back. New Zealand more has fat lambs because they had richer soil, and you could grow lamb and send it to the old country.
And we did go through at one time the dairy country. And they make lots of milk, and we also went through the wine country. Saw where they have, except for the hills in the background, they grow corn the same way we do here. And I say you could be looking out across an Illinois field, except I say there's 2,000, 3,000 foot hills or 5,000 foot hills in the background. But
so you hope that their agriculture is not quite so monocultural.
Well, part of the problem with New Zealand is if they don't make it there, it has to be imported. It has to be imported at a huge expense.
Yes.
And so that's why I say They have a very small population. They tend to be self-sustaining. They're very ecologically minded because they realize they're on a big island as a country.
Yes.
To the point where there was no trash by the side of the road. There was no trash at any trail in that country. Recycle bins of different types, composting, or organic, inorganic, glass, paper, every single bin in the whole country, even out in the middle of nowhere. But I say it was, and they have sort of a mindset that goes with that as well.
Even the ranchers that were overstocked have been turned back to nature. It's often with imported crops, but like trees and
they're trying to get rid of
grasses.
certain invasive species, but other things they're saying, okay, this is going to have to stay for economic reasons, and the environmental issues can be mitigated or not as bad as some other things. The problem are animals. I say sheep are now part of it. The hare are now a part of that country.
Yes, you mentioned hares, but there are also rabbits.
Yeah.
And they were brought by English people who like to hunt rabbits.
Yeah,
but there were no predators.
Yeah.
So I can see pictures of hundreds of rabbit skins, where one of the problems with overstocking was the overstocking with rabbits.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the English did this all over. They tried to export their local economy, their local way of life around the world. And, average Englishman at that time, hare and rabbit were good eating. So, you'd bring them with you. And sheep provided lots of different things. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So you commented to me that you notice a difference between the Englishman in New Zealand, different from a convict-started Australian. The speech patterns are different.
Oh, definitely.
And you can now recognize a New Zealander.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, a Kiwi.
A little more upper crust.
They're a little more open. I say that the Australians, I joke, except in the word "roo," there's not an R in the country. They don't pronounce their R's.
The Australian is really Australian.
Australia, I can't even do it, but
Australian.
Get me my voice coach.
You Australians have a problem with that. So now you
but
went to
it
Australia.
is very British because the whole time we're there, if you turn on the TV, the first thing was the cricket match. How was the cricket team doing, and how are they? The Hobart to Sydney sailboat race was while we were there, and that was big news, really big news. And they were having the Asian Football Cup, so Australia is hosting that and is a big deal there. So, football, cricket, rugby. I don't really follow rugby, but apparently everybody in the country does.
Rugby is rugby union and rugby league are two football games that are not.
But
the Australians call what you're calling football is soccer.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. They don't.
So they're sporting people. They take time.
Yeah.
If they go to church, they'll sometimes put their cricket back under the pew.
Yeah, and I say it is very British in that sense, but they have not taken a lot of the British words. They drive trucks. In New Zealand. Yeah, not lorries. You throw stuff in a trash can, not a waste bin. And, I thought I was I cut myself and thought I was being very cool by going and asking for a chemist for a plaster. And the person looked at me and goes, "It's a pharmacy and they sell Band-Aids." So, yeah.
Well, now you went to Australia.
Yes, yeah.
And so
that was what we ended up with.
You were in Sydney. You bought a battery for your watch in Sydney.
Yeah. So I'd never been to Sydney before. And it's one of those, everybody, you said I go to Australia. Well, I run into lots of people who say they've been to America. And I go, "Oh, really? Where?" And they go, "Oh, I've been in New York and San Francisco." I'm like, there's something else there. Well, I went to Australia in that sense. I actually went to two places. I did not go to, if I ever go back, I'm going to Perth and Alice Springs and to Melbourne and other places. But the only place I went was Sydney, big city for a couple of days, and then up to Cairns to see the Great Barrier Reef.
So you didn't climb on top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge or go up high and look down on the city?
I would have loved to have done that. We did go up on top of the Opera House and took a tour of that. And the other thing we did in the Sydney Harbor was we went for a day of sailing in a 12-meter sailboat, which was incredible. I'd do that again in a heartbeat.
It's a drowned estuary. It's a very good harbor, actually.
It's the most incredible harbor. I mean, San Francisco is probably the best harbor we have in the United States. Yeah, people will argue with me, but nothing compared to Sydney Harbor. It is so protected, so huge, all sorts of...
You don't get huge waves in it. I used to row around Sydney Harbor with an 8 crewing.
Yeah, and they have decided, they've made a decision that they're going to keep it as a recreational harbor, that Botany Bay is where they have all the oil tankers go to and the container ships, and that's about 20 kilometers south of Sydney Harbor. But Sydney Harbor, the only they allow a cruise ship in a day, and they also have ferries. But other than that, there's no commercial traffic. It's all fun and recreation, which is incredible for a harbor like that.
The waterfronts are often not occupied by high-rise buildings. They leave the view for people to see.
Yeah.
And
there are places, Sydney's a big city. And, there are places where they're building right up.
Don't have a lot of arable land. There's a thin strip around the east coast and across by Melbourne and some on the west coast at Perth.
Well, one thing that I ran into on this particular trip was climate change. Global warming is an issue everywhere now. In Australia, the big discussion is about the wildfires. A tenth of that country is burning, and they can't put it out because it's just so hot.
Get burned.
Yeah. Again, the evening news kind of led with that a lot of the times.
And they haven't gotten used to the fact that if you're in a land-based ecosystem, it usually burned naturally. And they didn't like to do that. It's like coming to the prairie and stopping the prairie fires.
Yeah, well, the problem is you're also now burning the cattle that graze on the land, and you want to keep it rather than let it go through its natural cycle.
And the drought situation is serious.
Yeah, and it's continental wide, and there were even in the area that we were in, it was supposed to rain a lot up in Cairns, up north, but they have not gotten anywhere near. And again, two of the things that we saw in New Zealand were the Fox and the Franz Josef glaciers. And what was amazing about that, I mean, glaciers are pretty amazing if you've never seen one. They're just huge amounts of ice with incredible torrents of water in the summer that come down. It is summer there, remember. And but what's really amazing is how much they have retreated just in the past decade, because there were signs. This was where the glacier was in 2000. This is where it was in 1880.
Is it a matter of miles?
It's a matter of hundreds of yards from just in the past few years. But I know it doesn't sound like much to say, 40 feet a year or 60 feet a year. Well, yeah, it adds up. And, the pictures of the glaciers back in, when it was first discovered, were in the parking lot, so to speak. So, and they'll grow back this winter, but they just won't grow back as much.
It has to do with the storage of water.
Yeah, it's fresh water. Yeah. It's the fresh water supply for millions of people.
Let's explain to people that Australia and the tip of the north end of New Zealand is almost in tropical rainforest. The monsoons come down. So if you were in Cairns,
we were right there as the monsoon season was starting. Yeah,
and you can get tremendous flooding.
Yeah.
The counterpart is when you go south to Melbourne is in a winter rainfall area. So you have to understand that, and that has a lot to do with the vegetation.
Yeah.
So you were probably in places where there was lots of sugarcane.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Went into the hills. There was lots of sugarcane growing. It was tropical. I mean, it was coconut trees and palms and
pineapples and
humid.
Bananas. And
and extremely
avocados.
Not so much that I saw. Now, that doesn't mean they don't grow them there, but yeah, a lot of the mangoes were huge. I mean, everybody has mango trees, that sort of thing.
You select your mango tree that are more edible mangoes, and the less edible ones go to the hogs.
And there was some dragon fruit and things of that sort, but you tend to think of that as being up north of there, even more closer to the equator.
Well, say something about the Barrier Reef, because you went to see the Barrier Reef before it died.
Well, this was the reason I went to Cannes. Not to mention the fact it was just it was a beach in the middle of the winter, but no, it was the real reason that we went to those two places, Sydney and then up to Cannes, because I am not a scuba diver. But
did you have to learn in order to?
No, it is so close to the surface. As a matter of fact, it pops up through the surface in a number of places.
So you could see it through the bottom of the glass.
Well, no, I snorkeled. So we snorkeled. The only trick is you have to wear. Okay, interesting, because I say there are places where this coral reef comes up almost to within 10 feet, and its surface is. We think of the Great Barrier Reef as this big, long barrier, but it's not. It's lots of little areas where
often around the island.
And you will build atolls, but they also build up just out underneath. And yeah, these are little one-celled animals that grow, and they don't grow very quickly, but they do die quickly.
Prone to acid, if you have carbonic acid in the water, they have shells that are calcium.
That will build that. And that's what builds the reef. And you do have to have some sort of die-off, because a live polyp can't build on top of another live polyp. So you have to
a whole story of it.
And so they build up these huge towers, these huge structures that are pretty incredible.
Biodiversity is really serious.
Oh yeah. Yeah, just in the small amount of time that I was snorkeling, there were hundreds of different types of fish, and I can now identify different types of coral and kind of what they look like and the colors and whether they wave and things of that sort.
People haven't always treated the Barrier Reef
in
a friendly manner. They harvest pieces of it and take it home and put it on their mantel shelf.
Well, and it turns out that these polyps, the animals that create the reef, have a very narrow pH range that they can live in, as well as a very narrow temperature range.
Yes, well, acid will rot their
and again, the temperature has to be very specific. And the people who live there, I mean, several of them confided that they expect to be able to have tourists come there for another decade, and then that'll be about it. And when we went out, yes, it is beautiful colors. Like, the coral has colors you've never seen before. But there are big stretches of gray, dead bones, basically, where the carbonic acid has, broken down.
Well, the Australians are currently selling coal to China. Yeah. And those ships have to go through the Barrier Reef, or very near to it. They pollute it.
Yeah.
And
well, all ships do.
This is a matter of business versus ecology. And we can remember the day when we had Bob Menzies as a prime minister, and he got lots of money by selling scrap steel to the Japanese, and then it came back in bullets. Well, and so something the same is going on with the current prime minister, who feels that the business of selling coal to China is important for a business point of view. And not everyone agrees with that. It's
a commodity-based economy in Australia especially. Yes. They're selling iron ore, they're selling coal, they have natural gas reserves, they have all this. The problem is commodity prices are falling worldwide. The last day that we were there, they actually reported that they expect $12 billion deficit in their government's economy this year because they're not going to get the revenue from the coal and the gas and other things.
They also tried to push their commodities out into the boondocks where you had 10-inch rainfall at the wrong time of the year, and then you had gross dust storms that you could actually see the sun, and it was blue because there was so much...
and again, we talk about this in this country. The whole fracking boom may be slowing down because the price of oil is not up. Well, the same thing may happen in Australia and New Zealand, that they're not going to mine the lime in New Zealand or the coal in Australia. But when the price comes back up, they're ready to get those machines going again. So
your wife is a geographer.
Mm-hmm.
What was one of her?
She is also my travel agent. Everywhere we went, the things we saw are due to her, and she really worked hard at this because it is not easy to get to New Zealand. It's expensive, and it is a long way, and it takes a lot of effort to get there reasonably priced. As a matter of fact, I can't think of his name right now, but the guy who played the Hobbit in the movies was on TV talking about how expensive it was to get there, and I'm thinking, he's Bilbo.
Sorry, in the new iteration of it, not
Yeah.
going back to
Anyhow, but one of the nicest...
Freeman.
Yeah, one of the nicest things I will say is if you get a chance, go to YouTube and look at the New Zealand Air safety video. You watch a lot of safety videos from American and Delta and United, but this one is by far the best. It deserves a YouTube spot. So anyhow, but yeah, New Zealand has an interesting culture, an interesting way of looking at the rest of the world, and it knows how the rest of the world kind of looks at it. Yeah. They have one musician that's made it big, Lord. They have, nobody hears about him much except as a side trip to Australia sort of thing. So, and I say Australia, they've got some real issues that they've got to deal with.
So, was this your last visit to the Barrier Reef because the climate is going to change?
It won't. It will. It's one of those things. It won't just completely disappear because I say it's not one long continuous barrier. It is a bunch of little separate
and
islands.
Also, it has a genetics, so that it has variety within the genetics. So you have a mutation, and you'll have an adaptation if you have time.
Yeah,
but
I've always had
it happening so quickly that you don't have time for that
to build up
mutation.
Yeah, if given enough time, I believe in the Gaia theory that it'll take care of itself. But with humans involved, we don't do things in a timely manner.
Years, you have time.
Exactly.
If you
in a human lifetime
30, 40,
is nothing.
50 years, you don't have time for that.
Yeah. Oh, and the oceans are generally in trouble, and we know this. And human nature is we can't deal with long-term problems. It's got to become a crisis before we deal with it. So when it becomes a crisis, we'll all deal with it at that point. That was my cynicism coming through. I hope not.
So
I hope
where is your next destiny to look at this part of the world or a part of the world?
Well, I got to admit, my wife and I did look into what it would take to go and stay in New Zealand for a long period of time. And if you're young, they do have work visas because I say they need people to just come in.
We do have people from here who have a house in New Zealand.
Yeah, if you buy a house, they'll let you stay there as well. Now, on a tourist visa, you're only allowed to stay there for 3 months, and then they'll kick you out before you get to come back. But yeah, it is an absolutely incredibly beautiful place. I know people who've bought houses there, and I now understand why you would buy a house halfway around the world, because it is some of the most incredible landscape, compact beauty that I've ever seen anywhere. Again, the United States is beautiful, but it takes weeks to drive across and see the same things you can see very quickly in New Zealand. So, just because of the size.
So that's interesting that your answer to me was you would go back to New Zealand rather than go to Madagascar or somewhere else.
Yeah, there are other places that are on our list. We have one place that we're going to go to. There's also an ecological wonderland / basket case. They tend to kind of go together. No, we may go back to Panama is our next trip. And I say Panama has an interesting
biodiversity of birds and the like.
But they have real issues they have to deal with as politically and as a country and economically, so that they don't destroy what they have.
If you go south from New Zealand, you go to the Antarctic.
Yeah.
So
you're not that far away when you're in the south.
You could be in New Zealand
and again, when
take a trip to the Antarctic, and then there's politics about who owns what and where. And what's happening to the ice shelf.
And again, I joked earlier that I used up my carbon footprint for the year, but when you travel, you do kind of think of what is my impact as a tourist, and I say part of it is environmental, part of it is cultural. the farther off the beaten track you get, the more impact you have.
Yes, if you go
as
to
a tourist.
if you go to New Guinea, you have to know that perhaps 100 years ago you had a cargo cult.
Oh yeah,
you had
still do in some ways. Yeah.
You had cannibalism to some extent.
Well, it's like one of the places I want to go in Australia is Tasmania. It's just
the last Aboriginals have passed there, and
there is a lot of culture
sad.
that goes along with going there. It's anyhow.
You tended to get rid of the Aboriginals and replace them with your own agriculture. There are a few part Aboriginals where seafarers would come into the northwest corner of Tasmania.
Yeah.
But basically, the Australian Aboriginal is extinct in.
Well, I mean,
in
agricultural, land-based societies almost always win over nomadic societies.
Yes, you bring in your television and you say,
and you can sit in front of the TV, whereas those people are off in their tent somewhere else.
3 little villages, we'll just exterminate you, and it'll be much better. We'll put in 25 acres of corn or soybeans, and and your rural sociology will be totally screwed.
Yeah, and I'm saying that's what happened to a lot of the Aboriginals around the world, a lot of the first peoples around the world is, they got pushed out. Africa is where this is happening now because there are still nomadic tribes, nomadic peoples there that, Okay.
So we've got 5 minutes, but I'm itching to ask you something about how you teach this sort of thing to your finance students. How do you work with them? It's a different culture.
I say one of the things is traditionally finance has not charged for externalities. That if it was an environmental issue or if it was something I could get from the environment and I didn't have to pay for it, you didn't even count it. The classic case is automobiles pollute the air, but I don't have to pay for polluted air in the cost of the automobile, and the company that manufactures the automobile doesn't have to pay for that either, because that's a cost that's borne by society, by everybody, and so we accept that. And as long and that's always been traditional finance. If I can't put it on the accounting spreadsheet, or if it's not something I pay for, then that's someone else's issue, someone else's problem.
Salvage I take out of the garbage can.
Yeah, your work.
Nobody's paying for it.
Yeah, because
except me, as I take it out.
Well, but who's paying you? That's you're an externality in that case because you're not on the books as being paid for doing that. But it is an effort. It is a cost to society because you could be doing something more productive. But unfortunately, because of the way the system is, that's a very productive thing to do. But once people learn, I don't know. I have sort of this argument about finance versus the environment in this sense.
Yes, you're in the Sierra Club. You walk the Appalachians,
and I appreciate statutory rules that people have to do things, but a lot of times in finance you think that if you just make it economically worthwhile, then people will go ahead and do it automatically. There's certain things that we do automatically because it's just easy to do and it's worth our while.
Well, we've come to the end, and we.
Well, I could talk for 2 minutes about that.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing.
But let me finish up the thing about finance is that one of the newest areas, of course, is sustainable finance, sustainability, is both an organization and for the earth. And like even the new MBA creed from Harvard says, that we will be good for the environment, good stewards of the planet, and pass on to the future. And that's something that business is just not acknowledged before.
So will I imagine you showing some of your pictures to your finance class?
Yeah, we'll talk about some of these issues for sure.
Well, this has been Dave Monk, your Prarie Monk, WEFT Champaign, and you'll hopefully will see some of your pictures on television and on YouTube. So thanks very much for coming and sharing.
Thanks for letting me talk to your audience.